This is the story of a moment in human history when technology, error, and misfortune combined to create the world's largest nuclear disaster. On the night of April 26, 1986, time seemed to stand still at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in the Soviet Union. Around 1:23 a.m., a routine safety experiment was underway inside reactor number 4. But no one realized that this routine test had actually given birth to a chain reaction that would change life in all of Europe forever. At that moment, the balance of pressure and energy inside the reactor had broken, and the atmosphere inside the building was filled with strange vibrations and anxiety. Workers realized for the first time that something was going very wrong. Alarms began to ring in the control room, indicators had crossed their limits, and with every passing second, the situation was becoming more unstable. In the midst of this panic, the emergency shutdown procedure was activated, technically known as the AZ5 scram button. The purpose of this button was to insert control rods into the reactor to stop the nuclear reaction. But what followed was the exact opposite of the expected outcome. As soon as the control rods entered the reactor core, a sudden energy spike occurred within the system, putting the reactor into an uncontrolled explosive state within seconds. A massive explosion occurred. The first blast severely damaged the reactor's upper structure, and within seconds, a second and even more powerful blast occurred, exposing the entire core. This was no normal explosion, but a collapse of a nuclear chain reaction where the energy was so intense that even steel and concrete were broken apart. After this blast, radioactive particles mixed into the air like a poisonous cloud spreading across the entire sky. According to scientists, the radiation released from this incident was many times greater than the combined nuclear explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Imagine that at that time, not just a building, but the entire environment had come under the shadow of an invisible death. But this was only the beginning. After this disaster, radioactive dust and gases affected not just Ukraine but all of Europe via the wind. Due to wind patterns, this radiation traveled thousands of kilometers away. Monitoring stations in Sweden were the first to detect abnormal radiation, after which the world learned of this disaster. Radioactive particles were recorded as far as the UK, Poland, Germany, and Scandinavia. In some regions, radioactive rain was even reported, where the water falling from the sky had itself become poisonous. The agriculture sector was also severely impacted because radioactive dust settled on the grass, which was then consumed by cattle. This process directly contaminated the food chain, and for this reason, thyroid-related illnesses were reported in thousands of children, as a radioactive isotope like iodine-131 is directly absorbed into the human thyroid gland. But behind all these facts, the real story was not just the explosion, but a combination of a flawed system, risky design, and human decisions. If we understand the background of this incident, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was an important part of the Soviet Union's ambitious nuclear program. During the Cold War, the USSR invested heavily in nuclear technology for energy independence and military dominance. The Chernobyl plant was developed during the 1970s and its design was based on RBMK 1000 reactors. These reactors were considered advanced at the time, but they contained serious structural weaknesses that later became the reason for the disaster. The plant was located not near Chernobyl city but 16 kilometers away in the Pripyat area, which was a planned industrial city where plant workers and their families lived. The 4 reactors of this plant collectively produced a significant portion of Ukraine's energy demand, which was a very powerful system for that time. The objective of the experiment running on the night of April 26 was simple but risky. Engineers were testing whether, in the event of a sudden power failure, spinning turbines could generate enough electricity through their own momentum to run emergency cooling pumps for a short time until backup diesel generators started. This concept was theoretically possible but created unstable conditions in practice. The test had been delayed, the staff was tired, and operational pressure was high. This combination prepared the ground for disaster. Inside the reactor core are uranium fuel rods where the nuclear fission process occurs. When a uranium-235 atom splits, it releases heat and neutrons that split more atoms. This process is called a chain reaction. To control this reaction, control rods made of boron carbide are used to absorb neutrons. Additionally, There is a graphite moderator that slows down neutrons so the reaction remains efficient. But in the Chernobyl RBMK design, the role of graphite was critical, and this design flaw made the disaster unstoppable. That night, when the reactor power became unstable, a byproduct called xenon-135 began to accumulate, which naturally absorbs neutrons and suppresses the reaction. This condition is called xenon poisoning, which makes the reactor unpredictable. To control the situation, operators mistakenly withdrew too many control rods, causing the reactor to enter an extremely unstable low-power state. Then, when a sudden power surge occurred, the system could not handle it. The emergency shutdown command inserted control rods whose graphite tips actually accelerated the reaction in the initial seconds, a design flaw that had been previously underestimated. This moment pushed the reactor into a supercritical state where energy release became exponential. Within seconds, steam pressure increased so much that the reactor's top structure physically exploded. In the first part, we saw how a routine safety test turned into an uncontrollable nuclear disaster. Now we move forward from the moment the first and second explosions occurred, and the whole world stood near a destruction that no one could have imagined at the time. When the first blast happened inside the reactor, everything in the control room shook. Panels began to spark, lights flickered, and instruments became completely unreliable. But the real terror began when the second and more powerful explosion occurred, literally exposing the reactor core. The steel structure was broken, the concrete lid was tossed into the air, and now the inside of the reactor was open to the sky. This meant there was no containment barrier left to stop the radiation. Radioactive material began to release directly into the atmosphere. The scene inside the plant at that time was nothing short of a horror film. Flames of fire, falling debris, and a strange blue glow caused by ionized air. This glow was not a sign of a normal fire, but a visual effect of the extreme intensity of ionizing radiation. Firefighters and plant workers still did not realize the true severity. They thought it was a chemical or electrical fire, but the reality was much more dangerous. The reactor's graphite moderator blocks had caught fire. Graphite is normally stable, but due to high temperature and oxygen exposure, it began to burn. This fire was not a normal fire because radioactive particles were mixing directly with the smoke in the air. This meant every passing second was spreading radiation further. By the time helicopters and monitoring teams understood the situation, radiation had already reached the upper layers of the atmosphere. Pripyat city, which was very close to the plant, was still following a normal routine. People were sleeping, children were in their homes, and no one knew that a cloud of invisible death had spread over them. But within the next 36 hours, the situation was to change drastically. Radiation levels were so high that the environment around the plant had instantly become a lethal zone. Firefighters were called on an emergency call. They were told there was a fire at the plant that needed to be controlled. They arrived at the site without proper radiation protection. To them, it seemed like a normal industrial fire mission. But as they got closer to the reactor, their instruments began to fail. Radiation was so strong that dosimeters were overloading. Yet, they continued firefighting, not realizing they were standing right next to their death. Meanwhile, radioactive dust and gases began to spread even more through the air. Wind currents started taking this cloud towards Belarus, Poland, Scandinavia, and northern parts of Europe. When radiation detectors in Sweden showed abnormal readings, an alarm was raised at the international level. Only then did the Soviet Union officially acknowledge that a serious nuclear accident had occurred at Chernobyl. This announcement came 2 days after the disaster, when radiation had already spread across multiple countries. The decision was made to evacuate Pripyat city, but this evacuation was not immediate. People were first told it was only a temporary relocation and were asked not to take much luggage. But the reality was that they could never return to their homes. Buses were deployed, and more than 50,000 people were removed from the city within 36 hours. But by then, many people had already received radiation exposure. Controlling the reactor fire was another massive challenge. Helicopters were used to drop sand, clay, boron, and lead to suppress the radiation. These materials were used because boron absorbs neutrons and lead can shield radiation. But this mission was extremely dangerous because helicopters had to fly directly over the reactor where radiation levels were at their maximum. During this operation, a helicopter crashed, resulting in the death of the crew members. After that, the phase of the liquidators began. These were the thousands of workers sent for the cleanup. Their job was to remove radioactive debris, decontaminate contaminated areas, and build temporary containment structures around the reactor. These people worked under extreme radiation exposure, where every minute their health was at risk. Many liquidators fell victim to severe radiation sickness within a few weeks or months. The heat inside the reactor had still not ended. Even after the explosion, the residual reaction of the nuclear fuel was ongoing, making the core extremely hot. This situation was creating another catastrophic risk. If the melted nuclear material reached the groundwater tanks below, a steam explosion could occur that would be even more destructive than the first two explosions. To prevent this danger, engineers and workers took an extremely dangerous decision. They had to drain the water reservoirs located under the reactor. This work could not be done by a machine because radiation levels were too high. Therefore, 3 volunteers risked their lives and went into the radioactive environment to manually open the valves. Amidst darkness, heat, and radiation, this mission was almost suicidal. But because of them, another possible explosion was avoided that could have devastated the entire region even further. In the following days, the Soviet government started damage control. First, there was a phase of denial and secrecy, but due to international pressure, they had to accept the truth. When the radiation cloud reached Europe, hiding it became impossible. Sweden's data exposed everything. In the next phase, a massive containment structure was built over the reactor called the sarcophagus. This structure was made of steel and concrete, and its purpose was to seal the radioactive material. For decades, Chernobyl remained a restricted zone. Even today, the 30 kilometers radius of Chernobyl is known as the exclusion zone where human habitation is not allowed. But the interesting thing is that nature has returned there. Wolves, deer, and wild animals are surviving freely there. The human absence has created an unexpected ecosystem, but the danger of radiation has still not completely ended. When the evacuation happened, people were given only 2 to 3 hours notice. They were told it was a temporary evacuation, so they should not take much stuff. But they left behind their homes, their lives, and their memories, and could never return. Today, Pripyat is a ghost city where buildings, schools, hospitals, and amusement parks stand silent, as if time stopped right there. Over time, a temporary containment structure was built called the sarcophagus. This structure was built over the reactor to seal the radioactive material. But this was not a long-term solution, so later a more advanced structure called the new safe confinement was built, which is a massive steel arch. Its purpose is to permanently isolate the reactor and prevent radiation from being released into the environment. This is considered a major project of modern engineering. Friends, Chernobyl was not just a nuclear accident, it was a warning. A warning that tells us how powerful technology can be, but if design flaws, human errors, and poor decisions combine, the result can be devastating. This story reminds the world today that safety depends not just on machines, but on human responsibility. And with this complete documentary story of Chernobyl ends here. A chapter that joins history, science, and human tragedy together.